Hi class. In this lecture, we want to continue our study in Chapter 6, talking about polynomial functions. By moving into Section 6.5, in this section, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how you factor polynomials, right? So this section, the factoring methods are going to be a little bit harder than the previous sections. We handle some of the different cases that might arise and how you factor them. Okay, the first factoring method I want to talk about is called factor by grouping. And you use this factoring method when you have four terms. Okay, so factor by grouping, you need to have four terms. So if you look at this polynomial, 1, 2, 3, I have four terms. Okay, we're going to use this method. Okay, so what you do, this is why it's called grouping. You begin by factoring the first two terms and the last two terms. So what you're going to really do is you're going to group the first two terms together, and you're going to group the second two terms together. All right, when you look at 3x cubed minus 18x squared, the GCF of that is 3x squared. All right, so you take a 3 out of the 3 and 18 and an x squared out of the x cubed x squared. And when you factor that, you're left with x minus 6. Now you look at the next two. What complicates this is this negative sign here. So you have negative 2x plus 12. So what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to factor out the 2. And then also whenever there's a negative in the middle, you factor out what's called the leading negative. So when I factor out a negative 2, the negative 2x becomes just x. And the plus 12, because I took a negative out, needs to turn to negative 6. Right? Because then a minus minus gets you back to the 12. Okay, notice here, this is what's great about this factor by grouping. Notice this is my first term. This is now my second term. Okay, and notice how they each have an x minus 6 in common. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this x minus 6 and whoop, factor it out. I'm going to remove it out. All right, just like I did like a 3 over here. I'm factoring it out. So when I factor this out, I'm left with 3x squared minus 2 and then times by that what I factored out, that x minus 6. So you can verify this result by finding the product. So if you were to FOIL this out, you would get back, okay, to the same thing. So this factor by grouping works. All right, so a warning, it is a common error to think of polynomials such as this is factored. Okay, you need to go a step further. So even though both terms are factored, the entire expression is still a difference, right, not a product. So a factored polynomial is a product. So like here, it's something times something, okay? Here, this is something minus something, so it's not factored. All right, so if a polynomial with four terms, we factor by grouping. All right, if it can be done, sometimes it can. All right, so this is all you do. You factor the first two terms and the last two terms separately. Then what's going to happen is if it can be factored, you'll notice that it'll have a common binomial, and you factor out the binomial as the greatest common factor. All right, let's do another one here. So I want to factor this 10x cubed minus 6x squared plus 5x minus 3. All right, so I'm going to group the first two terms together. All right, so 10x cubed minus 6x squared. The GCF of this is 2x squared. When I factor that out, I'm left with 5x minus 3. Now notice here when I group the last two terms, 5x minus 3, they have nothing in common. So I'm going to put like an invisible 1 in front of it, okay? All right, that just lets me know that the greatest common factor, the only thing I can factor out of them is 1. And then in parentheses, I'm going to put that 5x minus 3. Now look, they both have a 5x minus 3. I'm going to factor that out. What I'm left with is this 2x squared plus 1. And you can verify this, like if you were to plug this in your calculator, right? This expression, this factored expression, and the original expression, you will see that they are equivalent. So this totally works, totally. All right, so now what I want to talk about is factoring trinomials. Okay, we learned about how you factor trinomials in the previous section when they're x squared plus bx plus c. But now what I want to do is I want to stick an a in front of the x squared. So one way to factor this trinomial to the form ax squared plus bx plus b is what we call the guess and check method, or the trial and error. So you're going to make an educated guess at the factorization and then find the product of these guesses to see if any of them work out. All right, so this is called by trial and error, or guess and check as I call it. So let's look at this one here. All right, this is the 2x squared minus 5x minus 25. All right, so what I want to do is I want to factor this, okay, into something times something. All right, so Notice that when you factor, you have to have the first part of the FOIL. You have to have 2x times x gets me back to 2x squared. Awesome. But what I need to figure out is what goes here and what goes here. All right. So basically, what you're doing is the product of the last terms must be negative 25. Okay. So the last terms must be either 1 and negative 25, 5 and negative 5, or minus 1 and 25. So what you're going to do is basically write each of these pairs in here and see if any of them work out. So what I'm doing here, notice I'm putting the 1 and minus 25. Then I'm flipping it around, putting the minus 25 first and the 1, the 5 and the minus 5, the minus 5 and the 5, and then the other side, minus 1 and positive 25, positive 25 and minus 1. I'm just sticking them all in to these factors right here. So when you FOIL these out, what you're looking for is, does any of them end up being the same exact one you had before? Well, yes, look, this one here, 2x plus 5 times x minus 5, if you were to FOIL this out, gets back to the original one. So it totally works, okay? So we can say, therefore, then that this factors into the following, and it's awesome, all right? So when you factor a trinomial of this form, ax squared plus bx plus c, by trial and error, you want to identify possible products by using the fact that the trinomial can be factored as the product of two binomials, just like we saw. Then the product of the coefficients of the first term of the binomial is equal to a, right? Like we saw, and the product of the last two terms of binomial is equal to c. Let's do this one right here. So this is what I'm saying. I'm saying when you look at this, this 15x squared plus 26x plus 8, it's going to factor into this. Well, look, we know that a is equal to 15, b is 26, and c is equal to 8. All right, so you're looking for coefficients of the first term, 5 times 3, such that they are equal to 15. And then the coefficients of the last term, all right, must multiply together to be this positive 8. Right, so then to find the correct factoring of the polynomial, multiply the possible products by moving all these things around and identify which of the coefficients of x, all right, give you this sum in the middle of b. All right, so you'd have to go 5x plus 4 times 3x plus 2 and so on, and keep going, 5x plus 1 times 3x plus 8, and see if any of these things work out. And if you do, you'll eventually get to this. All right, let's look at this one here, where this is a rather complex one. So 6x cubed y squared plus 26x squared y cubed plus 24x times y to the fourth. Yikes, crazy. All right, so the first thing you're going to do when you see something crazy like this is factor out a greatest common factor if it exists. And indeed it does. There's the greatest common factor of this is 2x y squared. So when you do, this is what you're left with. All right, but the next thing you have to ask yourself is look at that crazy thing inside the parentheses. All right, if we factor further, okay, because it's a trinomial, can we get the result to be in this form? 2xy, and then in parentheses 3x plus what, a question mark, times x plus a question mark. The reason we have a 3x here is because the only way we can multiply this and this to get to 3x squared is one of them has to be 3x and one of them has to be x. All right, but notice it gets a little complicated because we have the xy and then the y squared here. So the product of the last terms must be 12y squared. All right, so the possibilities are all shown here. To get to 12y squared, you could have y times 12y. You could have 12y times y. You could have 2y times 6y, or 6y times 2y, or 3y times 4y, or finally 4y times 3y. And if you were to FOIL all these out, you would see that this last one is the one that gets you back to the original product or the original polynomial in here. All right, so the guess and check you could use. I actually don't like the guess and check. I think it can take too long. And so I want to show you an algorithmic way to solve it. All right, so this is called factoring trinomials by the grouping method. So instead of using trial and error to factor a trinomial, we can do this thing called factor by grouping. So to factor the trinomial of the form ax squared plus bx plus c, what you're doing is you're playing kind of a number game. You look for two integers, two numbers whose product is the value of a times c. So their product is a times c, and they sum to this middle term. Okay, so here's what you do. And then we will do an example. So you're going to factor this trinomial by grouping if it can be done. You're going to find numbers who multiply together to be a times c. Then you're going to determine which of those numbers, which of those ways it can be done, has a sum equal to the middle term. Okay? Those two numbers that you found, we call them m and n. So then what we're going to do in step 3 is we're going to take the term bx and split the middle term and write it as mx plus nx. Once you do that, you have a 4-term polynomial. And then all you're going to do is you're going to take that 4-term polynomial and you're going to factor it by grouping. Okay, the first method we saw. So another name for this technique is also called the AC method. All right, so let's try this. Let's factor 6x squared minus 7x plus 2 by grouping. First, I identify what a, b, and c are. Okay, a is 6, b is negative 7, c is 2. So first find the product, AC. Well, a times c gets me 12. All right, so here's what I'm doing. In step 2, I'm looking for two numbers, okay? These numbers m and n that have the product. So when you multiply these two numbers together, you get 12, but they have to sum to negative 7. Well, if you look at all the products, the only way that could happen is when you have to multiply to a positive, sum to a negative, is they both need to be negative. So negative 3 times negative 4 gets me 12. But negative 3 plus negative 4 also gets me negative 7. Okay, so I found these two numbers, okay, negative 3 and negative 4. That's awesome and important. So my two numbers here are negative 3 and negative 4. And what we're going to do is we're now going to rewrite this minus 7x as minus 3x minus 4x. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite this. My 6x squared minus 7x plus 2 is now equal to 6x squared minus 3x minus 4x. So now I'm going to factor this by grouping. I'm going to group the first two terms together. Okay, the greatest common factor of them is 3x, so I'm left with 2x minus 1. Now I'm going to group minus 4x plus 2. Now remember, when you have a leading negative, factor out the negative 2, and I'm left with 2x minus 1. Well, look, now both these terms have a 2x minus 1, so I'm going to factor that out. And I'm left with 3x minus 2 is my final answer. And you can FOIL this out, and if you do, you will get back to this. So I encourage you to try this method. It's a really good method.